The bicycle wheels turned slowly over the cobblestones, each rotation carrying her closer to a decision that would define everything that followed. She was 16 years old, her hair carefully arranged, her dress chosen with deliberate attention to detail that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with survival. The Nazi officer waiting at the cafe would see exactly what she wanted him to see. A young Dutch girl, eager for attention, flattered by the presence of a man in uniform. He would never suspect that the smile she offered was a weapon more dangerous than any rifle hidden in the resistance cellars across occupied Netherlands. Her name was Freddie Oversteegen, though the stories that would later emerge often blurred her identity with that of her sister Truus and their friend Henny Schaft, three young women who operated in the shadows of World War II with a ruthlessness that contradicted everything the Nazi occupation forces believed about Dutch girls. The year was 1943. And the Netherlands had been under German control for 3 years, a period that had transformed the quiet streets of Haarlem into a labyrinth of suspicion where neighbors disappeared in the night and resistance meant death if you were caught. The occupation had not arrived with sudden violence but with a creeping normalization that made collaboration seem reasonable and resistance seem futile. Freddie had watched this transformation from the perspective of someone too young to vote but old enough to understand that the world was burning. Her mother had raised her and Truus with an unusual openness about politics and injustice, hosting communist meetings in their small home even before the war, creating an environment where questioning authority was not rebellion but responsibility. When the Germans arrived, that household became a natural nucleus for resistance activity, a place where people who refused to accept occupation could gather and plan. The sisters were drawn into this world not through dramatic recruitment but through gradual immersion, helping first with small tasks, then larger ones, until the day came when someone asked if they would be willing to do more than distribute illegal newspapers. The request had been specific. Nazi officers were becoming comfortable in the occupied territories, moving through Dutch cities with the confidence of men who believed they had already won. They frequented cafes and bars, established routines, developed patterns. They were also, many of them, young men far from home, susceptible to attention from local women despite the regulations discouraging fraternization. The resistance needed these men gone, not captured or interrogated but permanently removed from the machinery of occupation. Traditional ambushes were dangerous and often failed. Bombs drew too much attention and led to brutal reprisals against civilian populations. But a young woman with the right approach could lead a target away from crowds, away from fellow soldiers, into isolated locations where the risk of collateral damage disappeared. Freddie had agreed without the hesitation that might have saved her from years of nightmares. She was not naive about what the work entailed. The instructions were clear. Make contact, establish trust, suggest a private meeting, lead the target to a predetermined location, and let the armed resistance fighters waiting there complete the mission. In most cases, she would not pull the trigger herself. In most cases, she would simply walk away before the violence occurred, maintaining plausible deniability. But the training included weapons instruction because situations changed, because plans failed, because sometimes the girl who played the flirt would need to become the executioner. The first time was the hardest, though not in the way later psychologists might assume. Freddie felt no abstract moral crisis about targeting Nazi officers. These were not innocent bureaucrats but men actively participating in an occupation that had already murdered thousands of Dutch citizens and would murder millions more across Europe. The difficulty was technical and immediate, controlling her fear, maintaining her cover, executing each step of a plan that offered no room for mistakes. The officer she approached that first time was a mid-ranking administrator, notable only for his access to transportation documents the resistance needed to forge. He was also, according to intelligence, a man who had approved the deportation of Jewish families from his administrative district, signing papers that sent them to camps whose true purpose was still being discovered. She met him at a cafe the resistance had scouted, a location with multiple exits and clear sight lines. Her approach was not aggressive but instead relied on manufactured coincidence, a dropped glove he retrieved, a conversation that seemed to begin by accident. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of face that might have seemed ordinary in peacetime but now carried the weight of authority and threat. When he smiled at her clumsy Dutch compliments about German culture, she saw not attraction but condescension, the same attitude the occupation forces displayed toward all Dutch civilians, amusement at the natives attempting to curry favor. This condescension was precisely what the resistance counted on. Nazi ideology had taught these men that they were superior, that the occupied populations were lesser beings unworthy of caution. This blindness created exploitable vulnerabilities. The officer never considered that the pretty teenager might be dangerous because his entire worldview rejected the possibility. When Freddie suggested they meet again, somewhere more private where they could talk without the crowd, he agreed with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled every variable. The second meeting was set for evening, in a park that bordered dense woods on the outskirts of Harlem. Freddie arrived early, confirmed that the resistance fighters were in position, and waited at the arranged spot with a heart rate that threatened to expose her fear. When the officer appeared, walking through the gathering darkness with the casual stride of someone who owned the night, she felt the full weight of what was about to happen. This was not a theoretical exercise or a dramatic story told by someone else. This was a human being who would cease to exist because of choices she was making right now, in this moment. They walked together into the woods. She kept talking, filling the silence with nervous chatter that the officer probably interpreted as excitement. She led him along a specific path, away from the street, deeper into the trees. When they reached the clearing where the resistance fighters waited, the transformation happened quickly. Men emerged from cover. The officer reached for his sidearm but never cleared the holster. Shots were fired with suppressors that turned gunfire into heavy coughs. Freddie turned away before he fell, following instructions to leave immediately, to be seen elsewhere, to establish an alibi that would hold if questions were asked. She rode her bicycle home through streets that looked exactly as they had hours before. Nothing had changed in the physical world. The occupation continued. Other officers would take the dead man's place. The war machine ground forward regardless of individual casualties. But something fundamental had shifted in Freddie's understanding of herself and her capabilities. She had crossed a threshold that most humans never approach, had participated in killing another person, and the world had not ended. The sky had not fallen. She had simply gone home, and tomorrow she would do it again if necessary. The numbers accumulated slowly at first, then with increasing frequency as the resistance network refined its techniques. Freddie and her sister Truus worked sometimes together, sometimes separately, adapting their approaches based on the target and circumstances. Some officers were isolated during staged encounters in public parks. Others were lured to addresses the resistance had prepared, buildings that appeared safe but were actually kill zones. The work required constant variation because patterns meant death. If the same technique was used too often, German intelligence would notice and adapt. Not every mission succeeded. Some officers became suspicious and broke off contact before reaching vulnerable locations. Some targets traveled with security that made approaches impossible. There were close calls when German soldiers appeared unexpectedly, forcing Freddie to abandon operations at the last moment and retreat through back streets, while resistance fighters scattered. The occupation forces were not incompetent, and as resistance activity intensified, their counterintelligence efforts improved. Informants and collaborators existed in every neighborhood, Dutch citizens who had chosen survival through cooperation, who would report suspicious activity if they witnessed it. The psychological pressure was constant and accumulating. Freddie was maintaining multiple false identities, attending social events where she smiled at Nazi officials while memorizing their faces and routines, operating under constant surveillance in a society where trust was a liability. She watched friends disappear into the concentration camp system. She saw families torn apart when Jewish residents were rounded up for deportation. She witnessed public executions of resistance fighters caught by German security services, their bodies left hanging as warnings. Every day the occupation continued was another day the Nazi regime consolidated power, another day that collaborators grew bolder, another day that rescue seemed more impossible. The resistance movement Freddie belonged to was not a unified organization with clear hierarchy but rather a loose network of cells operating independently, connected through trusted intermediaries who carried messages and coordinated actions. This structure provided security through compartmentalization. If one cell was compromised, it could not betray others it knew nothing about. But it also meant that Freddie often had limited context for her assignments, receiving instructions without understanding the larger strategic picture. She was told which officers to target but rarely given detailed explanations about why those specific individuals mattered. Trust had to flow in one direction. from the young operative to the leadership, with little flowing back. As the war progressed and the Allied invasion of Europe became increasingly likely, the nature of resistance work shifted. Early operations had focused on disruption and intelligence gathering. Later missions were more directly lethal, targeting the German military infrastructure that would oppose Allied forces when they arrived. Nazi officers involved in organizing defensive positions were priorities. So were officials responsible for food requisition, since starving the occupation forces weakened their operational capacity. Transportation coordinators who managed rail networks became targets because every train delayed was one fewer supply shipment reaching German units. Freddie's work was part of this larger strategic effort, though she rarely saw the results beyond immediate mission success. The officer she led into an ambush tonight might have been responsible for artillery placement that would have killed Allied soldiers in 3 months. The administrator eliminated last week might have been coordinating the forced labor that supplied German factories. These connections were invisible to her at the time, revealed only later through captured documents and post-war analysis. In the moment, she was simply executing assignments, trusting that someone somewhere was making decisions based on information she did not have access to. The toll this work took was not purely psychological. The physical risks were constant and escalating. German security forces had begun specifically looking for young women operating in resistance networks, having finally recognized the pattern after dozens of officers disappeared under similar circumstances. Checkpoints became more frequent, with soldiers instructed to detain women traveling alone or behaving suspiciously. Safe houses were raided regularly. The network of sympathizers who provided shelter and support was contracting as fear overcame commitment. Every operation now carried increased probability of capture, and capture meant interrogation by the Gestapo, an experience few survived intact. There were protocols for capture. Resistance fighters were instructed to reveal nothing for at least 24 hours. Giving their networks time to evacuate compromised locations and change operational patterns. After that, most operatives were expected to break under torture. The human body had limits, and the Gestapo had refined techniques for finding them. The resistance accepted this reality and planned accordingly, assuming that captured members would eventually talk and organizing cells to withstand the resulting exposure. What was not acceptable was immediate betrayal, giving up information before colleagues had time to escape. Freddie knew these protocols and understood what they meant. If she was captured, she would need to endure at least a full day of interrogation without revealing the names and locations that could destroy the entire Harlem resistance network. She was 16 years old and contemplating her own torture with the same analytical detachment she brought to mission planning. This was the psychological landscape of occupation. Normal adolescent concerns about school and relationships and future plans were replaced by calculations about pain thresholds and interrogation resistance. The war had not made her more mature in any traditional sense but had instead forced her to develop capabilities that peacetime society never required. The number 38 appeared in various accounts after the war, though exact tallies were difficult to confirm. Resistance work was documented poorly by necessity. Written records were evidence that could be used against you if discovered. The missions Freddie participated in were recorded sometimes in coded notes, sometimes only in the memories of surviving participants, sometimes not at all. The figure of 38 Nazi officers eliminated represented a best estimate based on operational reports and participant testimonies, but the true number might have been higher or lower. What was certain was that Freddie Oversteegen, along with her sister and their colleagues, had successfully executed a sustained campaign of targeted assassinations against occupation forces across multiple years, had survived when many resistance fighters did not, and had contributed to the broader strategic effort that eventually liberated the Netherlands. The liberation itself came not through resistance action alone but through the massive Allied military operations that crushed German forces across Western Europe. When Canadian and British troops entered the Netherlands in early 1945, they found a population starved by the hunger winter, traumatized by 5 years of occupation, and deeply divided over who had resisted and who had collaborated. The Oversteegen sisters emerged from the shadows not as heroes celebrated immediately but as participants in a complicated historical moment that needed time to process and understand. The immediate post-war period was chaos. Collaborators were hunted down and punished, sometimes through official legal processes, sometimes through street violence. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved publicly. Suspected informants were beaten or killed. The Netherlands was rebuilding both its physical infrastructure and its moral framework, trying to establish who had been brave and who had been cowardly, who deserved recognition and who deserved condemnation. In this environment, young women who had killed Nazi officers occupied an ambiguous space. They were clearly on the right side historically, but the work they had done was not easily celebrated in a society trying to return to peacetime normalcy. Freddie herself struggled with this transition. The skills that made her effective during wartime, deception, violence, paranoia, constant vigilance, were liabilities in peace. She had spent her formative adolescent years in a state of perpetual danger, where every social interaction was potentially an intelligence operation and every stranger might be a threat. Returning to ordinary civilian life meant unlearning these survival mechanisms, a psychological adjustment that proved more difficult than the original transformation into a resistance fighter. The person she had become at 16 was not the person she could be at 20, but the path between those identities was not clear. The nightmares came later, after the immediate survival pressures had subsided. During the war, there had been no time for reflection or moral inventory. Every day brought new operational demands that pushed previous actions into the background. But in peacetime, with no missions to plan and no officers to target, the accumulated weight of what she had done settled into her consciousness. She had participated in killing dozens of human beings. The fact that they were Nazi officers engaged in occupation and genocide provided moral justification but did not erase the psychological impact of the acts themselves. She had looked into the eyes of men who would die because of her, had smiled at them and touched their arms and led them to their deaths with calculated manipulation. Modern understanding of trauma recognizes that moral injury, the psychological damage from violating one's own ethical codes or witnessing events that contradict fundamental beliefs about justice, can be as devastating as fear-based trauma. Freddie experienced both. She carried fear trauma from the constant danger of occupation, the near misses and close calls, the knowledge that capture meant torture and death. But she also carried moral injury from the killing itself, even though she believed the targets deserved their fates. The human mind is not designed to kill other humans without consequence, even when the killing is justified. Soldiers returning from combat understand this dissociation, the way righteous violence still damages the person who inflicts it. Recognition for her wartime service came slowly and incompletely. The Dutch government eventually acknowledged the Oversteegen sisters and their colleague Hannie Schaft, who was captured and executed just weeks before liberation, as significant resistance figures. Medals were awarded, commemorations were held, but the full story of their operations remained sensitive for decades because discussing how teenage girls had seduced and killed Nazi officers raised uncomfortable questions about methods, about youth involvement in political violence, about whether certain types of resistance work could be celebrated without encouraging similar tactics in other contexts. Freddie lived into old age, long enough to see her story become part of historical record, long enough to give interviews and speak at educational events about the resistance. In these later testimonies, she was careful to contextualize her actions within the specific circumstances of Nazi occupation, emphasizing that what she had done was response to an existential threat, not a model for political activism in peacetime democracies. She resisted simplistic narratives that framed her as either a straightforward hero or a traumatized victim, insisting instead on the complexity of her experience, that she had chosen to participate in resistance work, that she believed it was necessary, that it had damaged her, and that she would make the same choice again if faced with identical circumstances. The strategic impact of targeted assassinations against Nazi officers in occupied territories remained a subject of historical debate. Some analysts argued that eliminating individual officers had minimal effect on the German war machine, which simply promoted replacements and continued operations. Others contended that resistance attacks forced occupation forces to divert resources to security and counterintelligence, degraded morale, and provided intelligence about German vulnerabilities to Allied planners. The truth likely fell somewhere between these extremes. Resistance work mattered but was not decisive on its own, contributing to a larger strategic environment that included conventional military operations, economic warfare, and political pressure. What was undeniable was the psychological impact on occupied populations. Resistance operations demonstrated that the Nazi regime was not invincible, that ordinary citizens could fight back, that collaboration was not the only option. In this sense, Freddie's work had value beyond the immediate tactical results. Every Nazi officer who disappeared sent a message to both occupation forces and occupied civilians. The resistance existed, it was capable, and it was willing to act. This message sustained hope during years when military liberation seemed impossible and encouraged others to join resistance networks or provide support to those already operating. The moral questions raised by Freddie's story resist easy resolution. Was it acceptable to use teenage girls as assassins during wartime? The resistance leadership clearly believed operational effectiveness justified the risk, and Freddie herself volunteered with full knowledge of what the work entailed. But the long-term psychological costs suggest that some forms of resistance work, even when necessary, extract prices that peacetime societies should be reluctant to pay. The fact that Freddie succeeded in her missions and survived does not mean the approach was without consequences, both for her personally and for our broader understanding of youth participation in political violence. Her legacy extends beyond the specific operations she conducted. Freddie Oversteegen became a symbol of female resistance fighters, challenging narratives that portrayed World War II as a conflict fought primarily by male soldiers while women maintained the home front. Thousands of women participated actively in resistance movements across occupied Europe, engaging in sabotage, intelligence gathering, and combat operations. Their stories were often marginalized in post-war histories that focused on conventional military campaigns, creating incomplete pictures of how the war was actually fought and who fought it. By speaking about her experiences in later life, Freddie helped correct this historical imbalance and ensured that female resistance fighters received recognition they had been denied. The bicycle wheels that began this story continued turning through years of occupation and into liberation, carrying a girl who became something other than what peacetime would have allowed. She had been trained by circumstance to deceive and to kill, had executed those tasks with effectiveness that saved lives by ending others, and had survived to face the complicated aftermath that victory brought. The woods outside Haarlem where she led Nazi officers to their deaths were ordinary again now, just trees and paths, places where families might walk on Sunday afternoons without knowing what had happened there decades before. But the memory of what those woods witnessed remained, carried forward by the few who were there, transformed into historical record, offered as evidence that resistance was possible even when victory seemed impossible, and that ordinary people could become extraordinary when circumstances demanded it, though the transformation came at costs that would echo through lifetimes.